Hey, how's it going, YouTube? Thank you guys so much for checking out the video and welcome back to Magswap Gaming. In this one, what I'm going to be doing is talking about the response curve. This is a long-awaited video, and it's one of my last videos about the settings, for now, for the controller. Now, I've gone through and talked about the basic setup. I've gone through all of my current setup. I did want to point out, if you have seen one of my previous videos, I did have the horizontal speed at, I believe, 20. Since TDM dropped, I bumped it up to 30 just because I wanted to have a faster, close range way of just navigating my character. And since then, it's actually felt really good. I've been able to drop high kill games, and I've been able to do a lot better with close range. So anyway, I just wanted to make a point of that I now have that at 30. Words are hard. Okay. So anyway, I'm going to go through and explain the response curves to the best of my ability. I did not develop the game. I don't have a perfect understanding of how these curves work because it takes a lot of math. But anyway, I have a pretty good understanding of how each of them works. I'll give my recommendations, and I'll talk about a little tidbit of tricks that I've at least found to make it a little bit easier to play with. Anyway, for those of you who do not know, the response curve is just simply the way that your input is recorded. Okay? It's a lot less necessary of a change versus before when there was classic and linear and there wasn't all these different sliders and the aiming just felt off in a way. Classic and linear were very, very different. If you wanted a really responsive aiming, input setup, you'd go with linear. If you wanted something that would be a little bit stickier, something easier to use, you would go with classic. Now, it was a little bit difficult because of the ramp up speed and all that stuff. If you got used to it, a lot of people use classic and they were, really happy with it. But a lot of them would use full auto weapons and didn't really get into the riot because it was kind of hard to have those very intricate fights. On the opposite end of the spectrum, it was a lot easier to have those, close range 1v1 fights with linear because it was a lot more responsive and you could really control where you want your reticle to be. But from range and from really fast fights that were a little bit farther away, it wasn't going to stick as much. Now with all this being different and changed, you can get a little bit more in depth and use these pretty much all the way around. Anybody, here's a disclaimer, anybody can get good with each of these response curves. At the end of the day, it depends on what you enjoy and the past experiences that you've had, the fights that you take. There's so many variables that goes into this. So just because I'm going to recommend, let's say, this setup for linear, doesn't mean that you're going to be as good with it as, say, two-step or exponential. All right, getting into some other recommendations. Exponential is set to default for beginners. This is perfectly fine, and I'd highly recommend beginners just to stick with exponential until you get your game sense down, until you learn all the different aspects of the game, and then you can go with changing it. The very default settings are actually pretty good. I don't mind them, but it's just not what I would like when I'm constantly playing this game and I'm trying to get really, really good. It's just going to come with time. But there's nothing wrong with the exponential response curve and the rest of these values. I will note that each of these response curves, my setup is the exact same for everything except if I'm going to run exponential or the two-step / classic, I'm going to bump this down, the right stick dead zone, to 0 or 1, at least less than 5. I would say, 0 or 1, use that definitely because you want that to be as low as possible because it's more responsive. It's quicker to actually activate that stick. But I have it at 13 because it feels really good for linear. Linear is much more responsive. It's a little bit harder to control. 13 is a random number. It could be 12 or 15, for other people, or 14. But with my stick, personally, with the stick drift, I think 13 is really good. And I wouldn't use any other setup for me personally. I love this for linear. For exponential and for two-step, I would actually, I'd be fine with a lot of different ways of setting it up. Linear, I need to have this specific setup because I feel like I perform the best at this when this is at 13. Anyway, moving on from that. So exponential, you're going to see a graph come up on screen that's going to show 3 different response curves. Another disclaimer, two-step is shown as cubic growth. I don't know if these are the exact same thing. I tried to look up two-step because this is a new term that they introduced. I couldn't exactly find if that was cubic growth. I don't think it is, but still on the chart it pretty much represents what I'm going to talk about. So anyway, if anybody actually knows if two-step is around the same, or if you have another term for it, let me know, because I'd like to actually learn a little bit more about it. Anyway, you're going to see that linear is on the far left, and then it shows the cubic, or what I consider the classic / two-step response curve, and then you're going to see exponential. The way that you can read this chart is over to the right, that's what's going to take more pressure, and the vertical or the y-axis is going to show your actual input. So what that's meaning is, let's say you're looking at the linear. It's a diagonal line. It's a 1-to-1 ratio. You go over 1, go up 1. It's a 1-to-1, meaning that it is following your exact rate of input. If I move here, it's going to go here. If I move here, it's going to go here. Whereas exponential and for the two-step or classic, I might try to go here, and it's going to end up going over here, because depending on my input, it's going to go a specific distance. Hopefully that makes sense. It's not going to really matter at the end of the day when you have developed a muscle memory and figured all this stuff out for your personal needs. Like I said, any of these you can get good with. It just depends on you, depends on your muscle memory and what you get used to. You'll move it a specific direction, and depending on your game time, your muscle memory, you will know how far it goes. The only difference is for me, for linear, it's a lot smoother. See how it kind of looks like PC aim? It just depends on you. It's a lot smoother. It goes wherever I want it to go, or wherever I put it. So for me, this is actually really important for like riot fights. Now I will say, another disclaimer, probably the third one, with the new aim assist, it doesn't matter as much, because let's be real, aim assist in this game is incredibly strong. So actually, linear is even more appealing because it's even easier to control. Now, like I said, with two-step and the exponential, the only thing that's different here is that I knocked this down to a lower number. Pretty much as low as you can get without having any stick drift. Exponential, what happens is if you move it, it takes a little bit more pressure versus the two-step, which is why you see at the bottom range at the 0 value, you'll see that the two-step starts earlier. So how I showed linear, if I move at this distance, it goes right there. Let's say I go to two-step, I move about the same, it cuts a little short. It just depends on what you've gotten used to. It's a little bit different of a ramp up. If I do this, see how it went a little farther. I put more pressure, it ramped up a little farther. Now, I will say this. Theoretically, if you take the exponential and two-step and you bump down the extra values, it's supposed to make it more of a linear, right? That's what you would think. It doesn't exactly work that way, because remember that there's 3 zones. There's the dead zone, the independent zone, or what I would just refer to as your response curve sensitivity, and then your outer zone, the extra speed. Remember that those extra values they only have to do with your extra speed. So the in-between zone, that's going to do a little bit more in terms of, how actually much your stuff ramps up. That's super confusing, I know, but I'm going to try to make this as easy to understand as possible. If I'm using exponential, let's say I do a figure 8, see how it's kind of choppy? It's not exactly following my rate of input. They're working against each other, okay? If I go to two-step, do the same motion, it's still a little choppy, but for me it's a little bit smoother, okay? Not as much. It's still choppy because I'm not used to it. I'm used to linear. If I try to do the same stuff, it's a lot smoother. Now, of course, I have this set up for the way that I like linear, but there's a little bit of truth how two-step and exponential, it's a little bit, harder to control in terms of like the diagonal movements. They work separately, in my opinion. If you want to consider the other two that have a ramp up, the vertical and the horizontal, it almost feels like they work against each other because they're different values. It could work the same if you put this up to 100 and 100. It could smooth that out. But for me, I need to have different sensitivities. So I want to choose linear. That actually makes it more responsive, I guess. I keep saying that. They work together, and so to speak. And so it makes these diagonal movements a lot easier to control. And again, it's going to depend on your personal preference. It's going to depend on what actually makes sense to you, your muscle memory and all that stuff, everything takes practice. But I would recommend for beginners, just stick with your exponential, get used to the game, learn game sense, learn the weapons, the hacks, learn the map. There's so much more to learn. The response curve isn't going to make you a pro. Get used to the game, learn the intricate details of it. That's what's going to get you good. Okay? And then when you reach a certain point where you feel like your aim maybe could get a little bit better, try out Classic. Maybe that'll be your second one. You might stick with Classic. Doesn't mean you have to go to Linear, because every time you change this, it's going to possibly change your sensitivity. It's going to possibly change your muscle memory. You're going to do a lot worse. If you're going from Exponential and Classic and then you're just trying Linear, you're going to get thrown way off. Linear is a whole different beast. That's one of the reasons why I'd recommend, if you're going to try out Linear, bump up your dead zone. It's a lot more responsive. It has an earlier, the rate of input. You see how it shoots up a lot faster than the other two. It's going to be a lot harder to control. So I'd recommend putting the dead zone out. Now, you see a lot of people running Classic or two-step. You can absolutely do some of the same stuff as Linear in terms of being more responsive and hitting your intricate shots. You can absolutely do it. It just takes time and practice. It's not something that I personally did, but you can absolutely do it. It just really depends on the own personal preference. But as a general rule, I'd recommend going Exponential. If you want to bump it up, if you want something more smooth, go with Classic. If it's not quite as smooth as you want, go Linear. It really depends on the personal preference. Okay. Really, really long explanation. Really, really long, boring video, I'm sure. But for those of you who stuck it out and actually, heard all this stuff, thank you. I appreciate you. I put in a lot of time of figuring some of this stuff out, figuring out, what I like. I don't plan on changing at all. I plan on sticking with Linear. I plan on making all of this, my permanent loadout, unless things change again. If they bump up the horizontal sensitivity, which I think they should, a lot of people don't like how it's super slow. And in fact, I don't even like how it's super slow. If it would be a little faster, I might bump down the extra speed. The only reason I turn this up is because the horizontal is already set at 100. So anyway, that's a topic for another day. I hope you guys enjoyed. This one was a little bit longer than I made it seem it was going to be. Keep in mind, of course, disclaimer, you can get good with any of these. It just depends on what you guys do. But anyway, I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you guys so much for watching. It's been a blast doing all these settings videos. I plan on doing more tips here in the near future. I'm going to help out a lot of the beginners. Refer to people, these videos if they're having any problems with sensitivity. And let them know that I answer every one of my comments. So thank you guys for watching. Take care.